speaking. I will now have the pleasure of introducing the panel. So first up is Charlie Deeks, who is the Evaluation and Monitoring Manager at Study Hire. We've got Dr. Susie Davis, who's the Evaluation Coordinator and Researcher in the Undergraduate Admissions and Outreach team at the University of Oxford. And we've got Professor Graham Atherton, who is the Director of the Centre of Levelling Up at the University of West London and leads NEON. So I'll hand over to the panel to introduce themselves. So Graham, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you. As Sophie said, my name is Graham Atherton. I'm Director of the National Education Opportunities Network. Many of you will know NEON. Many of your universities and organisations are members of NEON. You know, we are the national organisation that supports widening access and participation in higher education. We have around 150 organisations as members, around 100 or so universities, and we undertake professional development, research and advocacy in this area. So we produced a range of research reports related to access and participation, as well as analysing obviously secondary data and primary data in the area. I also recently have begun a role at the University of West London, heading the Centre for Levelling Up, which should be looking at place-based and other forms of inequality, both for the UK and abroad. So as well as that, okay, through NEON, we also lead World Access to Education Day. So we've done quite a lot of work looking at trends in higher education participation, access and other issues in other countries as well. So yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the questions when they come in.
Brilliant. And Susie, would you kindly go next?
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone, I'm Susie Davis. I work in undergraduate admissions and outreach at Oxford. I don't deal with admissions per se, but I co-lead on a program to support raising attainment in schools. And the program that we set up is with TCAT, which is the Challenge Academy Trust in Warrington, Cheshire. And they're made up of 4 primary schools, 5 secondaries, and an FE college or sixth form as well. And basically we work with year 5s. We just had a series of delivery days with them. And we also work with years 7, 8, and 10. And the idea behind the program is basically to sort of develop alongside teachers and early career researchers program of basically enrichment and supercurricular learning, but also sort of bringing into the classroom sort of elements or features of enrichment. So I think we're trying to do quite a few things, you know, some of them well, maybe some of them not so well, but so it's a kind of pilot program with schools. And I think it's innovative in the sense that we get to work with teachers to co-design the program and researchers as well, which is pretty cool. So, but yeah, that's the program in a nutshell, and a bit about me as well.
Thank you. That sounds really interesting. And Charlie, please.
Of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Charlie. I'm the Monitoring and Evaluation Manager for Study Hire. So I started in Study Hire in January, and since then we've been doing a few things. So after getting my head around everything, a lot of the time has had to been spent on monitoring. So obviously that's half of my role, is essentially working out exactly what we've been doing and with who, so we can make accurate reports. But we're now starting to ramp up our evaluation of the projects that we've been running this year. So alongside that, I've been doing a lot of things on formalising our theory of change processes, making sure they're sort of robust and work well. We're really focusing on trying to get input from multiple areas into all of our project plans to really create that sort of diversity of thought and make sure it's not just one person leading a project that they've led over and over again without any sort of evidence of effect. One of the things we're really trying to work out as well is how to incorporate really good effective evaluation into online events sort of on the fly. And we're starting to do training in that area, and I'm leading that for our consortium. And finally, we've also been trying to move away slightly from survey questions into the more in-depth evaluative work, and we've been doing that over the last couple of months, and that's gone varyingly well. But I'm sure that's something we can talk about over the course of the panel as well. So I'm happy to answer pretty much anything that you've got going.
Amazing. Thank you to our 3 panel members. So let's get started. I'm going to ask a question actually, and I'm going to ask, what has been the most challenging thing about gaining information out of students and kind of across the work we do since the COVID pandemic started?
I'm happy to go first.
Charlie, go for it, Charlie.
Yeah, of course. So I think from our point of view, it's been working effectively with schools specifically. A lot of the times, so we have a lot of people called Hellos who are sort of the higher education liaison officers, so they work directly with the schools. And we're quite lucky because we've got a really, really solid foundation within the schools where we can say, okay, well, we need the data from this sort of student because they've taken part in our activities and so on and so forth. But the fact that the schools now also don't have as concrete a line to all of their students as they have done in the past just means there's multiple extra steps to get any form of evaluation or monitoring data out of schools. And I think that's to be expected. And I think it's improved over time as people have become more sort of happy with the situations that they're in. They've created processes that work well for them. And it's also been very school dependent. Some schools have taken to it like a duck to water and are really good at doing it right from the start. Some have been quite tricky. Some have been and remain to be quite tricky in terms of the evaluation that we get. But it just means we have to sort of try and collect data in different ways. And a lot of the time that will involve, like I was saying, just trying to get everything immediately as soon as we're doing the event rather than sort of like doing an event and then capturing data afterwards. So I think that's probably been the trickiest part for us as a sort of consortium as a whole.
I think so. Is anyone else? Susie, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I guess for us, what we've seen in talking to head teachers in TCAT in particular is, I think over this past year or so, the schools have been doing a lot of surveys as well with their students, and not just surveys, but, you know, the sort of telephone calls with pastoral staff and all that sort of thing. And we're kind of, in a sense, competing with that as well, or rather the students have, many of them probably feel that they're being over surveyed and maybe, you know, being asked too many questions sometimes, and parents as well, by different people. And I think that's been the most difficult thing for us to sort of balance, because on the one hand we want to try and understand what's going on in the program and to help teachers and so on. But on the other hand, it's kind of also understanding from the student and parents' perspective that, you know, maybe they don't always want to answer questions about, you know, how things have been. So it's, yeah, that's for us. I think it's been a very, very delicate balance. But with the head teachers and the teachers have been amazing in accommodating us. So we've kind of, yeah, we've had to work with them very closely to make sure that we don't sort of over survey, I suppose, and we've had to like reduce a lot of our questions and sort of make them a bit more fun. I've been on Giphy quite a lot, so basically I put GIFs in everything now for any sort of surveys, adults included. So yeah, it's kind of changing how we sort of ask questions, I guess, and the mode of asking questions as well.
Absolutely, I definitely like the GIF efforts there. Graham, did you want to come in on that?
Myself. Yeah, I suppose, you know, obviously for Neon, we've done quite a lot of training with our members in terms of online outreach delivery. We've done 3 sessions, so we've reached all together over 130 or so people from a large range of institutions. And I guess, of course, the sort of pivot of work towards online creates challenges for data collection, particularly in terms of design of work and intervention, because you're looking at how work's been undertaken and delivered, and when it comes to online context, necessarily how you design in the evaluation is an opportunity and a challenge, because transplanting models to virtual settings in evaluation approaches haven't seemed to be necessarily straightforward. So I think I guess the sessions have really been sort of encouraging the participants to try and, you know, I guess design in different forms of data collection mechanisms into the way they deliver work. It's an opportunity, but also requires collaboration across teams as well. I mean, we find in that conversation that there's those who attend those sessions we've done often are from the practice and delivery side, and they work with others who are specialists in the evaluation side nowadays in the world of access work. So that creates, I guess, a challenge to be negotiated in that way. So yeah, I think it's interesting how designing those sort of approaches. I think that's the opportunity. But that's a challenge.
I think that's a really good point about working across teams and designing things in as well. I think it does have an impact. Claudia, did you have a question?
Just checking I'm the only Claudia in the room.
Yes.
Was that coming to me?
Yes.
I didn't actually have a question. I hadn't put my hand up or anything, but there's a range of questions that popped up in the group chat.
Thank you. Yes, Alice Chowan has asked a question. So have any of you tried using any incentives to try and encourage pupils to complete evaluation surveys? And has anything worked well?
I can't say, well, it's kind of had a mixed response, but I think overall positive. So my colleague that I work with on the program, Rebecca Bonsova, you probably know her from Study Hire and so on, but she tries to help by kind of choosing really nice books for the school libraries and things. And so we kind of use those as kind of incentives. In the end, we send them to all schools, regardless of whether they completed the surveys or not. But it's sort of like a nice thing, I think, and it's something that we'll, I think, carry on doing with schools. But I think they appreciate the sentiment as well. I think just, you know, trying to incentivize it.
Graham, did you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, this has been attempted, you know, in the past by work we've done, and it's got to be context specific for a start. I mean, incentives differ across different groupings. I mean, I think, I don't know what Susan's alluding to as well there, strategic incentives for schools and others to participate, obviously what we've considered in the past, and those incentives don't often come direct learning incentives. I mean, you know, other forms of partnership working, making the case and the argument for participation at the school and college level is often really important, as opposed to individual learning incentives. I mean, it can be effective, but again, it also can be costly. It kind of depends on the nature of the project you're undertaking and the level of the learners that you're working with as well, I guess. I mean, it depends. I mean, it's been done before, but we've also found that it's been of moderate success in the past as well in some contexts, not university.
Amazing. And Charlie?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, like I was saying a little bit earlier, it tends to be very school specific. So schools, if they know that using incentives works really well for them, that might be something that they do specifically. But on occasion, we've also made instead of it being an incentive, we sort of make it a condition. So we say, well, we have to have 30 responses from your school before we would consider doing this event with them. We sort of do it that way round, and I think it's a bit like what Susie was saying. Actually, we would probably still do the event with them even if they didn't quite get 30, but doing it that way just sort of gives them the soft pressure to say, can you get this filled in, can you ask your students to do this, and so we do it that way. But I mean, we also try some of them. I know some schools and some programs that we've done have tried sort of more non-standard incentives. So we've used things like food vouchers in the past for like Deliveroo and Just Eat, that sort of thing, and just sort of trying to work out, again, with as much input from the people on the ground who are actually running the sessions and are closest to the sessions, what would work best for that group, and sort of going from there. So that seems to what's going on so far. And again, with mixed results, there's been nothing that's been across the board perfect, but it tends to be better when we just try and tailor it as specifically as possible.
Just another point to make on that issue, I guess this relates back to what I said before. We had our training for those delivering online evaluation. I guess the concept of incentivising, I also have got.
Can everyone still hear me?
We can hear you. I think Graham's gone.
Right, okay.
Oh, I
went off the call.
We can hear you, but I can't see you currently. But okay, well, we'll come back to that because I have a feeling that Graham was about to say something really interesting, and unfortunately, it's just cut out at the wrong time there. We'll wait for him to get back on. So I've got another question for the panel then. I've got, what are the best platforms for asking evaluation questions. One of my personal favorites is Mentimeter. I'm a big fan of it because it's so dynamic and engaging to use. So Charlie, I don't know if you had any platforms you're particularly keen on.
Yeah, and I think you hit the crux of the matter there. Is it's got to be something that's engaging. It's got to be something that works well within the session that already exists. So anything like that is ideal. In terms of the sort of like longer form survey responses that we like using, I think my favoured platform is online surveys, formerly Bristol Online Surveys. It tends to be just the best and most robust survey machinery that exists at the moment. But it sort of depends on what you want to do. Google Forms and that sort of thing tends to be good enough for most things, but yeah, I tend to prefer things like online surveys. But if you can fit in Mentimeter, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in a minute, but if you can basically do anything that already fits within the session that you're running, that seems to be the best way to get any responses at all, because it doesn't require some sort of special effort on the part of the student to sort of get the response.
Amazing. And Graham, Susie, apologies for a second. I'm just going to finish off Graham's last point. Apologies, Graham, we lost you.
Didn't I? Sorry about that. The problem, isn't it? Now, I guess what I'm saying is, back to what we were talking about before with the training we did, is the kind of a conceptually incentivization issue embeds the idea that this is something we don't want to do, and that's the problem. That's the key problem here. The evaluation bit's the bit that nobody wants to do, and therefore you've got to incentivize people to do it. And if you're building that frame in what we're doing, then you're never going to overcome that problem. You can throw incentives at it and it can do what you want to do, but if conceptually your argument is that this is the bit you want to do, if you present it to them as the bit of medicine after the cake, so to speak, you get the sweet, but to get the sweet, you've got to take the medicine. If you conceive it that way, you always got that challenge, I guess. Now, how you get over that isn't easy, but I mean, where we felt in the training was a chance almost, this, I've been doing this for 20 years, there's a chance here almost to redesign in things that have been happening for a long time virtually, trying to think how you redesign in the evaluation bit so it doesn't become the bit of medicine you've got to swallow to get the sweet afterwards.
I think you raise a good point though, because it being the nasty, it's always the thing that even as practitioners we're a little bit reluctant to do sometimes. So I think that's a good point and a good element, something I'll be reminding the team of later. Susie, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I think, that is a really good point. And I think it's something that in our team as well, I've been saying for a while, but kind of half jokingly, that we kind of need a new name because evaluation kind of, it hints at something that happens at the end, and it's by the nature of the word, and evaluation is meant to kind of encompass like the whole program, isn't it? Like the planning, the monitoring, everything else, and you can't really have the evaluation without the planning bit, or you can't have the feedback bit at the end without the actual planning to understand what you want to get feedback about. So yeah, I'm all for sort of changing our identity almost, I think evaluation maybe has the word itself has maybe run its course, and maybe something else might kind of signal to people, schools and practitioners as well, that it's a bit bigger than just at the end. I don't have any cool suggestions for words, but I do think we need a sort of rebrand almost, for the type of work we do. Because I notice as well, and it's probably the case in lots of universities, that our team kind of gets consulted also at the end. When business cases and things are being put together, it would be so useful if we could get involved from the beginning. And like you mentioned as well, Charlie, that the whole idea of theory of change, that's what we're trying to develop with different teams, but often it kind of happens after the fact. So, and then we're kind of retrofitting things in. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what the solution is. As you said, Graham, it's not an easy solution, there's no easy solution, but I do think we need to think bigger maybe with the type of work that we're doing, and sort of rename it accordingly and reconceptualize maybe, what we actually mean by evaluation. But
Definitely.
I agree. I think your point, Susie, very good. I mean, I think the actual embedding of evaluation within delivery is tougher, particularly in an online context. But your secondary points about ensuring that you're not retrofitting and you're building in evaluation through the whole process is actually within our control. It's within the control of our delivering wide access work within departments and institutions. You can control that bit a lot easier. The bit of actually reconceiving it in the minds of the learner so it doesn't become something tagged on the end they don't like to do, that's tough, definitely. But the bit of actually before where you actually see this as a life cycle issue you're building from the outset, it's exactly, we've done evaluation training in Neon, I've done it for the past 4 years, and that's the first thing we do in the first session is thinking of the whole research strategy point. So that's actually more within our, not your control, but within our control as practitioners, as deliverers, it's the way we call ourselves, rather than the other bit, which I think is harder. But I entirely agree that I think this is where the opportunities lie.
Yeah, and something that I think is also really important about doing that sort of pre-work is that it really engages the mind of the deliverer as an evaluator. So it's not just having the evaluation team that does the evaluation and the delivery team that does the delivery. It's having an evaluation team that supports the delivery team to do the evaluation. And sometimes we'll do our own evaluation alongside, and that's fine. But sort of having evaluation really built in from the beginning and making sure that that is something that is, yeah, we'll try and build it into a session. We'll try and make it natural. We'll try and make it work really well. That's a really hard thing to do, but we'll give it a best shot. And the best way to do that is to try and incorporate it from the earliest point available. And that's why we're trying to sort of get all of those theory of changes. For stuff that we're doing already, it's great to have and it's a good start. But I'm trying to sort of really say we need to get everything that's being planned from now on a theory of change started up, ready to go. And then hopefully those sort of things will come along naturally with that because everyone's thinking about it so early on. But you're right, it's so hard to do, and we're just sort of giving ourselves the best shot at doing it rather than sort of being sure that we can actually achieve those things at this point.
I think, sometimes outreach professionals have to take a bit of responsibility as well for wanting to do the evaluation and for seeing the impact. I think people sometimes need to see the impact of something to understand why it's important. And sometimes there's a time lag sometimes on data, especially on the data we collect in terms of, did it get more students to go to university from a UniConnect ward or whatnot. So I think showing people what you can actually get out of the data and how it can really help inform the work that they do next might be really helpful. It's not all on the evaluation teams though. It's definitely on outreach as well to make sure that happens. So we've had a question from Yasmin, which says, how can you integrate evaluation as much as possible into the outreach activity? We've talked a little bit about that, but she also asks, marry that required information that we need to meet ethical and GDPR standards. And there is a couple of questions about GDPR and what kind of information we need to collect and how many responses makes a good kind of a good grouping, a good representative pot. So I'll throw that out there to the panel.
For the first question about it was kind of about engaging more people to participate in evaluation and stuff. My colleague Rebecca, again, she had this really cool idea, which maybe you guys have tried as well, where we might try and actually do a session on we already run sessions about collecting data and analyzing data and that sort of thing in a sort of science and language context. But I wonder if doing something, sort of more explicitly about evaluation in an actual delivery session with young people might kind of, again, signal to them how, or they can then see the importance of being able to collect data and understand data about their own experience and about their, classmates' experience and that sort of thing. So that could be like a small idea to maybe incorporate in delivery. This idea of what does evaluation mean and what sort of questions would you ask on this topic and how would you ask them and how would you kind of get your classmates to actually answer the questions or get your teachers to answer the questions and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's one thing that springs to mind.
That's a nice approach for building understanding there. Charlie,
Yeah,
did you
I
want to?
agree with what Susie says. I mean, I think if you're thinking about working with young people primarily here, there's no reason we should treat this young people as we treat any other group. I mean, you have to understand the importance of why you want to do this. Why is it important? We can't just assume a priori that they would think this is an important thing to do. We need to place it in terms they understand and make it feel a valuable part of the intervention, no matter what it is. I mean, this is where the skill of delivery comes in, but it's where the between those, if there are differences in departments between institutions and evaluators, should come together, because yeah, I think we do need to make it feel attractive and important and interesting, and engage them in the process of data collection. I think where indeed more explicit projects have been undertaken that involve young people as peer researchers, this is kind of I guess an expanded concept to where you're heading. Maybe they've actually been rather successful. We've seen over the years. So it's not as if per se young people don't want to engage in the collection of data and evaluation. I mean, and I guess we said before, look, if it's going to be presented to them as something that nobody really wants to do, we've all got to do it, then nobody's going to want to do it, are they?
Yeah, and I think one of the things, sort of leading on from that, one of the things that I try and impress on delivery colleagues who are trying to do some evaluation within their work is basically just to be very honest with the students that are involved about exactly why we're doing it, exactly what they're doing. Obviously, in terms of the data collection stuff with the privacy statements, obviously be honest there. But what I'm saying is for the actual evaluation, we say, well, we want to do this because we're trying to get better at this, because we want to know what you think about this, and so on and so forth. And obviously doing it in a way that doesn't then skew the results, but just being super honest and just being like, well, we're doing this for a reason. This isn't something that's just annoying. This is actually a legitimate thing that we're trying to get a lot of help out of you from. Just coming back to the main question as well, and one of the things that I think when I've spoken to people doing delivery who want to do evaluation within their work, which is pretty much everyone as well, it's a good point to say that pretty much everyone wants to do evaluation in some way. It's just sometimes people are unclear about exactly how to get it going. Is I think people think that evaluation is a lot more complicated than it is sometimes, and I think actually you can get away quite often with just doing sort of very simple, like a quiz at the beginning and a quiz at the end, or just something quite simple that gets what you want to know, isn't super in depth, doesn't mean you have to do any like really hardcore data analysis or anything, but just tells you the answers that you want to find out. And then the skill is working out what the question should be and that sort of stuff, and that's where we can get involved as evaluation teams. I would imagine a lot of other people are doing this already, but one of the key ways that we do it is we integrate evaluation questions onto our baseline surveys and questionnaires. So when we're collecting data from students, the demographic data we need to monitor them, we'll also add questions onto there that might be specific to the project that they're looking at, or there might be sort of more general HE specific baseline surveys questions. So we sort of make sure that it fits ethics and GDPR by sort of making it just part of the very wider sort of data collection effort. But otherwise, I think the question of trying to integrate evaluation into outreach is just one of the questions that we're still trying to work through. And like I say, trying to make it as sort of like natively intuitive as possible for the students is probably my key piece of work. And using Mentimeter or a quiz that they might otherwise be doing in an event and that sort of thing is probably the best way of going about it so far that we've found.
Brilliant. And so a couple of questions, quite a few more about GDPR and basically asking ethical questions. So what advice would you have for people going into schools on those questions? Also, I should also add using online surveys as well, and external online surveys, and how they will comply with GDPR.
I found that one of the most valuable groups, I mean, obviously as somebody who works affiliated with a university, is just working with the InfoSec team at whichever university you're at. And they tend to basically have all of these answers already for you, and sort of making good friends with them has been absolutely invaluable in sort of the terms of the work that we're doing. Usually there will be institutional guidelines on exactly what to do. So I know somebody's pointed out that for Google Forms, there's sometimes their university will say no or yes. It again, just very much depends on sort of the university policy. So we can use Google Forms and we've got that signed off already, but I understand, yeah, that some people won't allow you to. So it's basically, I've just been working through InfoSec and sort of working with them and making sure that they're on board with all of the data collection that we do, and then that way it's sort of signed off. But that might be different.
I think Charlie's answer reveals one of the challenges that we think we may sometimes think of GDPR as something that comes from above and is given to us externally, but it's not. It's interpreted, because we're talking about some institutions that interpret the use of certain forms as compliant and some forms that don't. So you've got lots of actors, stakeholders, that includes university, includes schools, who will interpret all forms of data protection in rather different ways. That doesn't make that any easier. It makes it actually more complicated. But it does give the key message that we have a set of guidelines that we're there to interpret. So there isn't a sort of concrete set of things that everybody interprets the same way. To the extent there is some, but there's a lot of differences, and that's what comes out. And this makes it actually more complicated. But I mean, Charles' advice is very sound, but it also makes us think that, again, this interpretation issue, it is important to keep in our minds when we're thinking about these questions.
I mean, I think it's caused some problems in some places, because sometimes schools have said on differential organisations, sometimes schools have even said, you know, we don't want to give you ethnicity data, for example, because it's sensitive. So it can cause issues when it's interpreted that extremely, and certainly where there's schools that we would have worked with before over the years.
Well, the fact it's interpreted differently also gives you the ability to have dialogue with people about that interpretation, because, you know, to keep in your mind it is a matter of interpretation, and, you know, not asking people to reverse their own policies or where they place them, but to remind us in our minds that we are interpreting these things here, and that we may work with other parts interpret them differently. So it does give one the ability to have a dialogue about these issues, which I think is important if indeed, you know, we are facing challenges in obtaining information we wish to.
And I think it can be particularly difficult from a UniConnect point of view, is where in different institutions within the UniConnect consortium are interpreting it totally differently. So it might be, for example, that one institution is using public task, the other one is using consent, and then you have problems with the data and how you can sort of share that around. So it's, I think one of the big things is communication, about being on the same page, making sure that everyone is interpreting it in the same way in the sort of group where it's necessary to be sharing the data specifically. That's been a hurdle that we've sort of come up against recently. So it is sort of just knowing where everyone is and how everyone's interpreting the data differently. You're absolutely right.
Grand. And we've had a couple of questions back on instant feedback and kind of a concern, I think, about students not having access to the digital devices that they need. We've had a lot about kind of digital poverty or deprivation. So what can we do to kind of bridge that gap for students who might have access to equipment to take part in some of those sessions?
I can talk about one of the ways that we're sort of doing that is, so again, first of all, we're very lucky again to have very good contacts within the schools and very good relationships with the schools that we work with. So again, we just work on a school by school basis and sort of work out what they're doing. Some schools, now they're back, are all in the same place, so we're actually just using the same sort of methods of evaluation that we might have been using in the past in a face-to-face context, but slightly adapted for online delivery. So the old classic sort of put post-it notes on a wall where you think something's happening, that sort of thing, we can do again, and it works in a classroom, which it obviously hasn't been able to be done so far. And we can sort of remember now the stuff that we used to do, and the fact that we can actually bring that along and adapt it for this sort of new situation, even though we're not in the room. So we're sort of moving back towards, in some way, or we can start moving back towards those sort of methods, which I think is a really nice thing to be able to do, because it is one of the hardest things, absolutely, especially when everyone was in sort of different remote places and didn't necessarily have the sort of things that we need. And importantly, the schools didn't know that students, I mean, to their best efforts, they're doing a brilliant job, but they just don't know what they don't know, and they don't know whether the schools have, whether the students have the adequate sort of devices and stuff to be able to make that work. So ideally, we'll do it that way. Ideally, all the students will be in the same room and a teacher can facilitate this sort of data collection. But sometimes we sort of have to assume and try and sort of collect as much data as we can. It's not ideal, but it is a bit easier now students are back in the classroom.
Definitely. Anyone else want to come in? So So Neil's put in a question, which is, what have you found to be the most effective methods and approaches to capturing impact over time? So it's asked specifically about the short and longer term effects.
I guess this kind of goes back to our theory of change, and we have a set of, or different sets of measures for short-term, medium, and longer-term outcomes. And particularly for a program that's supporting raising attainment, ultimately I think people like the Office for Students want to see outcomes such as raised grades at GCSE and so on. But when you're working with year fives and you're working on a program about enrichment, it's a bit odd, I think, to suddenly say, oh, we're going to see improvement in SATs at Key Stage 2 or something the following year. So yeah, for us, I think it's been a challenge to stay true to the kind of spirit of the program, which is about exposure to new experiences, enrichment for all, not just the sort of high prior attainment top 10%, but for the whole school. So it's a kind of roundabout way of so the way we've gone about it is we ask a series of questions based on the educational research literature around young people's experience of school and their relationships with their teachers. And because the program we co-design the program with teachers, these are all sort of relevant things for us to understand. They're also really high or strong predictors of attainment, for students, and things like academic self-concept, self-regulation, all of those things. So those are the sorts of things that we ask questions about, and we tend to use questions or items from instruments already out there in the literature, and we sort of look at that on a sort of year-on-year basis. I think the other challenge we've had, and I think all of us have had, is that sort of almost resetting of the data last year and this year, and the sort of year-on-year change doesn't really quite make sense anymore. And it's it's kind of understanding how we can actually move on from that as well. And we also collect sort of qualitative feedback. We also do interviews and things with teachers and other stakeholders. So that's another way we try and get a better understanding of who we're working with and what they think about it.
Excellent, thank you. I really like the idea of doing some feedback with teachers and some more in-depth feedback with teachers and other stakeholders as well. I think that's important. I bet they will have something to say about the last year, I'm sure, in comparison. But yes, it's a good point about changing data and resetting of data, because everything has pretty much changed. Like, you can't really look at previous years, even in the number of activities, the way they were done, everything is very, very different. So yeah, I think that's a notable change in the data. I did want to ask.
Oh, sorry. Oh, no, I was just going to say, and the sort of combination of teacher and student feedback, I think, is really powerful. And, it does mean collecting even more data, but I think the power, I think, of looking at sort of things like teacher-student relationships and all that sort of thing. These are so key in looking at sort of any sort of aspirations or expectations, for higher education, or just achievement and attainment. So yeah, like involving different stakeholders, I think, and particularly like student teachers, sort of those stakeholders, I think has been really important for the program.
Absolutely. And we've had a good question from David, how we measure certain concepts. So for example, attainment, we all have our own interpretations of these concepts, what metrics are used and how we measure them, which is good, but it can affect comparability.
Yeah, I mean, it can do. I mean, it depends. I mean, if you're talking comparability across the broad field, so you're talking about comparability across institutions, across projects. I mean, your challenge essentially in this space is that the way that the field is created is that you have 100 plus organisations, all doing similar but slightly different things, with relatively small sample sizes from a research angle point of view. So from a broad quantitative research point of view, you're not working with significant sample sizes, which significant sample sizes would be those at least in the 4 figures, which you don't see. So that's essentially your broad policy sectoral challenge. In that context, you're going to have issues of comparability, and you've got everybody interpreting things slightly differently, even core concepts such as attainment. And also, I think I'm not sure what you need to be your solution to that necessarily is, other than constructing mechanisms of dialogue within that space, which allows people therefore possibly to establish more shared concepts if they wish to do so, or at least understand the concepts that others are using, because that dialogue has to happen. Because if you reimagine the whole space, you can reimagine the whole space as one where you had a very strict national programme which everybody followed, which I'm not saying you should have that by any means, and we never had that. Name Higher was nothing like that, and now G-Connect, but that's a different way of conceiving what we do. We've got a different approach where you have all these people doing very similar but slightly different things across all these different organisations with different identities. In that sense, the only way to overcome the conceptual differences is to have dialogue between people to try and establish what they may be and whether there is room for commonality. I think.
Yeah, and I think again that hits the heart of why I think creating theories of change is so important, and specifically the idea around sort of getting a very, very wide range of views into even something as small as the terminology that we're using here. Because, so for example, if somebody says, oh, we want to raise, my bugbear is about raising aspirations, and where you're saying, oh, okay, well, we want to do this project to raise the aspiration of these students. I'm like, well, what do you mean? what does that mean? What does that entail? Can we break that down? Can we use the literature that's out there to sort of put some direct and concrete measures in now, so we can actually try and measure this in the future? And I think comparability can be important, and it can be, but I think it's usually most important from a monitoring point of view. If we're doing something that specifically requires monitoring of a certain value, I will be very, very specific in what I collect in terms of the data. If it's something that we're trying to identify ourselves, so say it's just a project that we're doing ourselves that doesn't necessarily directly contribute towards OFS specific goals, say it's we're trying to raise attainment in a certain way, I will be much more flexible in what we mean by attainment and how we measure attainment in that sense than if I was to be doing something on from a monitoring point of view.
Brilliant. I think that's really, really helpful, actually. Thank you to the panel on that. I've got a question from Jalal, which is, does anyone have any experience of using tools other than surveys when evaluating? We did cover a couple of them earlier, but I just wanted to see if anyone wanted to add to those.
I'm happy to talk about the snapshots that we're going to be running. So something that we're trying to bring up and running are snapshots. So essentially just 15 to 20 minute short conversations that have been, the questions for which have been curated by both the people who have created and run the sessions, but with some input from relevant parties as well. So that might be people who are either taking part in the sessions, are part of the target groups that we would work with as part of the sessions, and that sort of thing. But we're trying to sort of get a very honest and upfront look at how exactly they feel about both the sessions that we've been running, so there's the old process evaluation that we're doing there, but also about the impact that it's had, about the sort of ideas from them on the topics and the problems that they might be having in general, so we can also help to give them support in that sort of way. We are just getting these up and running, so this is something that I've been putting in since I came into post, so it's not something we've actually run yet. But again, it sort of tries to bring in as many people as we can to these evaluation processes. So we think that's going to work well. The problem we're having is getting people to sign up for it, as always with all of these sort of things. So we have got some booked on, we have got some people working on it, but yeah, it's sort of like trying to get as much information as we can that again aren't just activities, but we think it's a really solid and useful form of evaluation for the work that we're doing, because it fits in specifically with the work that we're doing. That's not the only evaluation we're doing on these programs. We're not saying that's our evaluation, that's it. We're also doing things like pre and post surveys, we're doing longitudinal work, we're looking at their achievement, that sort of stuff. But we think it's a really, really nice and useful way of sort of supplementing the knowledge that we have from the more quantitative side of things.
And these are students that have been on kind of long-term, kind of sustainable sessions. They're presumably not one-offs.
Yeah, and these are sometimes students that have been on the sessions, but they're also a lot of the time people who will work with the students on these sessions. So sometimes we might get teachers to do this. We're looking at getting parents and carers to do this as well. So it's just trying to facilitate that sort of discussion space for as many people as possible. And what we're finding is really important is having the people running the sessions to actually do those things. So like I'm not doing the snapshots. I'm not the evaluation guy that's been sort of like helicoptered in to run a session. I'm training the people who are delivering the sessions anyway and who are helping out on the sessions to deliver the evaluation, because it's a much more sort of comfortable and friendly atmosphere if you know the person, you've seen them, they've delivered your sessions in the past, to try and get better sort of data and information out of them in that way. And I think that's the main thing. Shall I answer Yasmin's question here as well while I'm there? So a lot of the time, it is quite tricky in terms of how we're doing it. Partly we're doing it with the what they call with incentives. So we're saying, yes, we'll give you some extra money for this. We'll give you some. This is what we're using the food vouchers for, and that seems to be quite popular. Yeah, that seems to be quite popular for what we're doing. However, it is just quite tricky to do. Sometimes the draw enough is just being able to talk in more depth to the person running the session. So we've said, like, this is also a chance for you to converse with the person that's running the session if you've got any other questions that they're doing, and if you've got any other questions that you have about any of the stuff that we're up to, you can ask it on this session if you'd like, and we sort of give them that opportunity to then ask more questions at the end about applying to university, do whatever, depending on what the session's about.
I think that sounds really, really interesting and very different, actually. I think we might have a few people wanting to steal your idea, Charlie, from
sure.
from the chat. It's very popular. I had another question that came in from Louise, which is, what positives have come from COVID, and what can we take forward and embed into our best practice?
For us, I think it's taken a lot of travel time out, which has been amazing, that we could then, spend on actually planning activities, talking to teachers better, getting the teachers together with the researchers in like one space, whereas before it was always sort of, clashing calendars and train tickets and various nightmares. So that's been really positive for us. And I think also this this idea of being able to understand each other a bit more, and the different ways that we work, and sort of, I don't know, sort of develop kind of different relationships with people, because you kind of have a view almost into their and the other side of them, kind of at home and things. So I think that's been quite a positive thing for us.
Thank you. And Charlie, any positives from COVID that you'll be taking forward?
I think there are some positives in terms of things like embedding technology into the way that we run these sort of sessions. So the fact that we can do sort of wider reach, wider impact sessions that are still relatively well attended, that are still sort of like interactive and good work that have been done. I think it's been overall, it's been quite tricky, and actually I've only sort of caught half of it, because my previous role, while it was in evaluation to a degree, this has been much more of a sort of solid full evaluation role now. So I'm only sort of just about seeing the tail end of it, where actually we're able to get sort of back into the more traditional evaluation methods. But I think if anything, I think it will be sort of the increased use of technology in evaluation.
Definitely. Graham, do you have any positives from COVID?
Positive. Well, overall, I think obviously, we can't lose sight of the challenges that COVID's presented, of course. But I think, I agree with Susie and Charlie about some of the things that have emerged. I mean, I think from the delivery angle, I think it's interesting. I think it was very face-to-face outreach work prior to COVID. It was a big challenge moving things digitally. And to an extent, I think digital divide issues are huge, but At the same time, you may argue that possibly being very face-to-face meant you weren't quite keeping up with the way in which young people engage with the world. And possibly this might be a way of us thinking about how we engage with the way that our learners, targets engage with the world. I think where the big challenge will be now is if we move, as we all want to do, we all keep hoping we will do, to back to the more face-to-face world that we all recognised over a year ago. What do we keep from this process and what do we not? A lot of investments been placed in work, both delivery work, evaluation work by institutions and partnerships over the past year, and inevitably, you know, that some investment work will just be of that time. It had to be, but there'll be things we developed we want to take forward. I think that'll be now our challenge. How do we build hybrid programs that both allow us to use technology to better engage with the learners we want to work with, that allow us to understand impact better, but also how do we return to face-to-face because it's what's part of our work and because it allows us to therefore reach young people and learners for whom digital access is compromised and we can't necessarily ourselves do anything about that. So I think those are our challenges. But yeah, I think there are some positives. We have moved. And I think also, like I said before, panelists, it allows us to have broader conversations. You know, we've done things where people have come together to speak, at least, and to change practice, which wouldn't have happened as easily face to face, really, because it just isn't possible. So I think actually, you know, from the Neon point of view, there are bits in Neon's portfolio that will remain virtual, bits that won't. Well, it's working that balance out. We don't have the answers to that, like none of us do at the moment.
Yeah, because I remember, like, before COVID, we had tried to have online meetings with teachers in the different schools and stuff, but the internet connections were just terrible. And so we quickly abandoned that idea and we went back to face-to-face meetings. But you know, over the COVID sort of year, you know, lots of changes have had to happen, and some schools have been lucky enough to have improved connections and things. And now we can so easily have meetings with teachers online. It's amazing. Like, no one cuts out anymore. You know, we can actually hear full sentences, and then, like, you know, we can have researchers actually, you know, hearing what teachers have to say and stuff. And so, you know, whereas before it was sort of like, you know, not sure whether we should try this. It's a bit, you know, controversial, maybe, to not be in the same room. But now it's so normal, I guess, normal in inverted commas, and it's just so commonplace. I think that's, you know, I think it can be a good thing for, you know, particularly for people who might not have necessarily engaged with this before. It's so easy as just clicking join here and then joining the meeting and then talking to us. It's pretty cool.
I completely agree. I think it has really revolutionized how we talk and connect with each other. And I think there have been positives. For us, it forced, you know, at BNEU, it forced us to have a real big think about our activities and to just pause and stop and just think, you know, how can we do things differently? And that was actually really refreshing, because when you're a small team and when you're really busy, you don't always have the time to do things like that. So I actually think it was genuinely helpful for us to have a forced kind of stop to get thinking about, you know, what we were doing and how we could do it better. But I'm just going to take it. It's close to the end now, so I'm just going to take one last question, which is: is there any research in the area of WP and outreach, or indeed evaluation, that you would recommend?
Yeah, I've got a couple that come straight off the top of my head, if that's okay. So one of the ways that my practice and research is really influenced by is Neil Harrison and Andrew Waller. Harrison and Waller, they do some really, really good work on possible selves. So it's a sort of education-y psychology sort of idea, and this comes back to my bugbear rat aspiration that I was mentioning a second ago, that essentially students from basically every background have very high aspirations, pretty much. It's the idea and the problem of whether you can see yourself as a certain thing in the future, rather than it just being some sort of like weird, unknowable goal. And it's sort of the idea of WP is to then allow students to foresee themselves in a certain career or at a certain place or as a student or as something they want to do, rather than it just being just something that is so out of their own so out of their realm of experience that it just doesn't make sense. So it's called Possible Selves. I've probably not done a great job of explaining it in that very small snippet of time, but it's really, really well worth a read. And Harrison and Waller are probably the two people that have talked about it the most in the WP context. And if you're really interested in post-qualification admissions, take a look at some of Graham's work, because it's absolutely fantastic, especially the stuff about international post-qualification admissions, because it puts everything into a really interesting context for the UK specifically.
Go on then, Graham, since you had such an amazing transition there.
Thanks for that, Charlie. That's very good. I didn't pay him to say that, by the way. I totally agree on Neil's book. I think the Possible Self stuff is really good. I'd encourage that. I mean, I think also, I think about, where is there things that one can read that broadly relate to the work that we're doing, and put it in its broader context. So, for instance, Michael Sandel from Harvard has recently wrote a book on meritocracy, and it's in the US context, and it's broad about the concepts of meritocracy in the UK, in the US, and it kind of challenges quite a lot of things that we think we're doing, but that's important to have that challenge. I mean, I think, again, the aspirations work that Neil does challenges that as well. So, I mean, Sandel's book on meritocracy, it's good sometimes to read things that don't actually accord with your view of the world, for instance. I mean, David Goodhart's book on Head, Hand and Heart as well. I mean, it's about WP, but it's about the challenges facing communities in this country, and they feel they're left behind. Now, a lot of that actually I don't necessarily agree with, but the point is that reading it is very important, because it then, that understanding that helps you then reframe what you're thinking about as well. I mean, it is good, and I think there's a lot of things. I think that there's sometimes too many things that emerge out. I mean, the Social Mobility Commission's reports are always very good. I mean, their work is less solutions focused, more challenge focused, but again, some of it quite place related. That really, I think, also helps understand some of the data around differential outcomes and education outcomes by place. So, I mean, the stuff they commission, come out with stuff from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, that's all I think, really, really important work to try and keep abreast of, really, if possible. Yeah. And internationally as well. I mean, I always find there's value in that. I mean, obviously, I've done quite a bit of international work, but there are people in other parts of the world doing things like us, not all the same. And you're becoming so immersed in our own work, our own focus, that we kind of we need to step back and, like you were saying, Sophia, see the broader picture, and that could help with that kind of.
Yeah, definitely important to look at different perspectives on it as well. I agree with that, different cultural contexts. Susie, bring us to a close, please.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I just want to agree with Charlie on the Harrison and Waller. Big fan of that, their work, and this thing about possible selves. And also we've started doing a lot more thinking around, rather than aspirate, or in addition to aspirations, looking at expectations and asking questions about expectations of the next thing for young people that they might think about doing, and kind of thinking very carefully about the difference between aspirations and expectations, and the sorts of questions that we ask young people and teachers as well, teacher expectations as well. So yeah, the one thing about the literature that I would suggest, although it's I don't know if it it's something that it's quite noticeable, I think, how WP research is almost kind of separate from research around school improvement and effectiveness and all that sort of thing, that has been happening for such a long time, and we try and bring those two separate but extremely connected fields together. And so the way we do that, I guess, is by looking in the literature around like school improvement, and like I said about teacher-student relationships, classroom context, the classroom climate. All of those sorts of things are really important kind of predictors almost for attainment, and things like expectations and aspirations. So yeah, looking, I think, a bit more at the sort of educational research literature around school improvement and effectiveness, because there are so many ways you could kind of, link how we do WP practice and what happens in schools. And it's kind of, we sort of do this implicitly, I think, at the moment. And I think like looking explicitly at the literature that, as such rich literature that we have in those fields, I think we need to have more conversations about those. So maybe like that could be the next panel or the next conference or something, like bringing those two fields together a bit more.
Well, we'd certainly love to have you all back to discuss it. I just want to take some time to say thank you to Susie, Charlie and Graham for being an incredible panel. And thank you to everyone for joining us and all the questions firing in. It's been a really, really interesting and informative debate. So thank you so much for that. And all the best. Everyone stay safe. We've got more Twilights. They're on the Study Hire website. So please go along and check for the rest of the sessions. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Sophia. Thanks, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.